Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you come across this Patrick Lovell Truth Bomb riff on Sunday, May 28th, 2023 at 2 o'clock my time. And happy Memorial Day to you all. Happy graduation to all that are going through the process. And happy to everybody who deserves happiness. It's a little difficult for some and easy for others, but you never know where you're going to fall on any given day. And, for the most part, I guess I'm in a good mood considering that I just found out that we've found some really interesting allies that are doing some let's just say allied work on our behalf that I just got exposed to out of the blue. And I'm happy to know that people are starting to act on some of what we've been trying to get out there in a grassroots way. But I guess I just wanted to, as always, which is a little bit different than scripting. I don't script these. I just kind of riff off the top of my head. And I decided to outline a little bit of what it was that I wanted to say this afternoon because it's just again, so remarkable, all of the things that converge at the same time to ultimately validate everything that I'm trying to do, that we're trying to do as a group. Who's we? I'll get into that in a little bit downstream. But at the same time, it's really difficult to be heard. It's really difficult to penetrate the noise, but it's extremely important. It's necessary. It has to be this way. And what is this way as opposed to something else? Well, it has to be this way in terms of organic. It has to be me trying to connect with you to try to convey what it is that I know to just whoever listens to this. And of course, everybody comes into these sorts of things from their own perspective, given technology and whatever might be happening in your life at the moment that you listen to this, if you do. But I hope that you'll first like and subscribe and share because, like everybody else says on YouTube, if you do that, we're going to be able to increase the opportunity for bandwidth and then coverage, and then ultimately, hopefully, get the message to as many people that need to hear this as possible. But where I'm coming from at the moment is that given all of the stuff that come at us every day, whether it's just a lot of, I don't know, the war, the political war, the ideological war, the economic war, whatever war maybe, uh, you know, in the midst of that takes up a lot of your attention and bandwidth, that, it's leading right now to, of course, a lot of positioning for presidential candidates in the early stages of what's going to become the presidential election. And I've already seen what I think is really the state of play. I swear to God, it's just, and maybe I'll be validated downstream by this, but I'm absolutely convinced that the establishment, whoever that might be, and I think we all have a decent understanding of who the establishment is. It's the money, it's the big money, it's the big pillars of what we all have to depend on to live in this modern era, which might be constituted from the five pillars, I'd say, of what make up our economy, which would be finance, financial, finance, the fossil fuel industry, big agriculture, big bio, pharma, that sort of thing, and then of course military industrial complex, and those generally, and all of the things that come down from there, and their different sort of mosaic, like maybe transportation or industry of some sort, but those are primarily the sort of pillars, if you will, of the American economy, which means the power of how things operate in this country. And, we're supposed to be a democracy. And a democracy is the opportunity for the population to vote on whomever the country elevates into positions of either running for specific office in Congress or the Senate, of course, in the judiciary, and a lot of different layers of that. But then, of course, the presidency. And the way it looks like to me right now is that the system wants Biden to run against Trump. They want a rematch. Why wouldn't they want a rematch? Because it captures our attention. And I think the establishment is pretty confident that they'll be able to easily beat Donald Trump. But at the same time, it's absolutely absurd that Donald Trump isn't in prison. Given everything that we've seen for now years, that he's the front runner for the Republican Party. But I'll get to some of that a little bit later as I kind of infuse some of these thoughts. And different than what I normally do on these particular truth bombs and these riffs, is I just kind of shoot from the hip, but I've got a little bit of an outline that I'm going to try to follow. So the thing that's really front and center of what I think would be the priority of everybody's attention at the moment was a deal that was done between President Biden and the Speaker of the House, Representative McCarthy, where they got an agreement on the debt ceiling. And I read this interesting New York Times article that I think reflects what it was that I just said. I went to this really thick, deep article of information, which to me felt like it was a validation of President Biden's presidency, that he's willing to reach out across the aisle against people within his own party that are going to be very upset about certain agreements that have taken shape and form, and but he's willing to do that for the sake of the country. Okay, well, there's a mainstream middle of the line. Like, look, we've got somebody who's a professional at the helm that can manage, what we need to do as a society so that we don't completely destroy the economy. Which, of course, it looked to me like the Republicans, and I think any of us paying attention, were willing to do. But you really didn't understand what exactly they were negotiating until you got three-quarters of the way through the article, when it really got down to the brass tacks. And the brass tacks on the Republican side is you're not going to investigate the rich through the IRS. You're not going to reverse tax cuts for the rich, particularly our donors. And we're going to create hoops for people that are in the social safety net, whether it's food programs, I think through SNAP in work sort of baselines, as well as I think for Medicaid coverage and that sort of thing. And while you're going to have nobody up the backside of the rich, that's what the negotiation seemingly reflected. In addition to, unfortunately, I think for a lot of people hoping that they were going to get their student loans expunged, I suppose. That was off the table. And, no cuts to military budget, that sort of thing. So it's the same old, same old. And another thing I was tracking on as we were getting closer and closer to the deadline was, it appeared that there's plenty of tricks that the Treasury could have pulled, not to mention maybe 14th Amendment by the president and that sort of thing, to make sure we continued moving on. But all of the drama surrounding the debt ceiling and the battle in Congress is it's a battle over power. It's a battle over who's going to be able to determine who the country works for, quite frankly, and who's making the decisions and what purpose. But did it have anything to do with whether or not the United States can pay its bills? Of course not, because we're a sovereign currency that can create as much money as it needs to pay the bills that Congress passes. And that's just fiscal policy. So the only thing holding us back, and if any of you out there have been, in the MMT camp for a long time, we're told and we're taught, and it seemingly is completely correct in this particular happenstance, is the fact that, Congress can create any job budget that it wants to. And if you had everybody on the same page and everybody understood the problems for what they are, you could theoretically create an infrastructure budget, which of course was also cut by, or at least I think long-term projections of spending on infrastructure bill as it related to new energy paradigm, I should say. And that's obviously why the Republicans would want to neuter that as well, because of course, if you're a Republican, chances are you're getting a lot of the donations for your campaigns from the fossil fuel industry and, of course, the financial industry that backs that up. So a lot of these incredibly immense problems that we're facing as a global society, that we actually have had the technological know-how and the resources to pivot to a new paradigm for at least 20 years, that would have cost substantially less than what it is that I'm, about to reveal to you throughout the body of this truth bomb, is that it's who's in power based on dark money and the way we've co-fangled making, I guess, corruption legal with Citizens United. And the best investment and control is, of course, a corrupt politician, which all played out in the debt ceiling. And it's not 1976, it's not 1984, it's not President Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill negotiating for the betterment of the country in one of these particular crushing scenarios. It's two polarized camps, and Biden's trying to be the guy that he's been for the last 5 decades, quite frankly. But he plays by the machine's rules, okay? And that's the reality of our times, and it has been for decades. But of course, they solved the riddle, so I guess markets aren't going to collapse because of the debt ceiling limit. We're going to pay our bills, and so there's not going to be a cascading waterfall domino that destroys the world, but it'll be something else. And I think it's going to be collapse of banks, especially with interest rates that the Fed might do. But, the long and the short of this part of what I want to bring up to you and why is that nowhere in any of the conversations, whether it's from mainstream media or really anybody in what I would call the independent media that has become somewhat of its own echo chamber, and that would include a lot of people I like to listen to for the most part, but sometimes I'm a little bit hedged and it's difficult, whether it's Russell Brand and Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald and a lot of really smart guys that are tracking a lot of things, but they've got very questionable things happening at the same time. But the bottom line is nobody's talking about what it is that I'm talking about, which is you can't look at the debt ceiling, you can't look at fiscal spending, you can't look at what we can do to be able to manage our economy without understanding that after the great financial crisis in 2008, when the entirety of our financial system was an engineered fraud that we show you in our incredibly important work, www.thecon.tv, blew up the world. And ultimately what happened is finance was like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? They were hat in hand with the Federal Reserve, and because the Federal Reserve works for the financial system backdoored illegally through the lender of last resort capacity, Federal Reserve Act 13.3, where we provided 30 trillion. I always say 29 trillion because that's what the Levy study revealed, but the guy who wrote the Levy study later said it was actually 30 trillion. So 30 trillion in backdoor illegal loans that saved the financial industry, that destroyed the world. And that's the world we live in. How do I know they did it illegally? Well, because of everything I show you in the con. It was a massive grift. It was a massive control fraud. It's racketeering. It's not rocket science. And we show you all the different pieces. So I'd really encourage you to check out the con. And it's really important to check out the con because it's not going to be out there for much longer. But going back to the debt limit and the revelations of the Federal Reserve working for the financial system is working for the top 0.001% that funds everything. And the bottom line is that once you understand how the financial industry can make money, which we show you one monumental piece of it because housing is central to everything. And there was nothing anywhere near as big as the great financial crisis in history, quite frankly. And, and a lot of people want to look in the rearview mirror and kind of put it behind them, including the great journalist Matt Taibbi. But it's still the thing that reveals everything that we're dealing with. And so monetary policy, which is what I just described to you, based on what took place with the Federal Reserve, that is different than fiscal policy. But at the same time, the way the Federal Reserve is structured is that it's supposed to be accountable to Congress. And Congress should have managed and understood, given the calamity of the disaster, which was the largest racketeering conspiracy in the history of the world, should have used all of the apparatus, the institutions of the United States to do the investigation that would reveal to the world that we are truly a democracy that is guided by the rule of law, which of course we're not. And we haven't been for at least 13 years. There's been corruption throughout the United States forever, but not at this level. This is just a whole new world. And, for the last, several years, everybody's trying to wrap their head around corruption, but they can't wrap their head around corruption, or they decide to cherry pick that it's somebody else's corruption, and then they ignore their side's corruption. It's all absolutely ridiculous. But again, it played out here with the debt ceiling scenario. And in the end, quite frankly, to maneuver back to fiscal policy, if we did have everybody on the same page in Congress and we recognize that we want to get off of a fossil fuel paradigm, we could easily recreate the energy paradigm of the United States and how we consume things in a way that would work for we the people in context to all of the problems we've had for the last 20 years that are just getting monumentally worse by the day. But of course, we don't do that because everything is a perverse inverse ruled by the minority as a republic in this era because we've legalized corruption, and we haven't legalized most of the corruption that takes place. Of course, as we're seeing in all of these different investigations of Donald Trump, who is a reflection of everything that's happening on Wall Street. But of course, because we can hold him maybe accountable depending on how far they let it go, which I think he should have been in prison a long time ago. If it was me who did all of the things that Donald Trump is guilty of, if I didn't rise to that level, I'd be in jail and my life would have been destroyed, and everything that I gained from the fraud would have been taken back, and that's how the law is supposed to work. But in this particular case, no, it doesn't. But interestingly enough, I come down on the mainstream media a lot, but because they've missed, in fact, completely missed, not just the 2008 great financial crisis, but also 9/11. And I don't know what to think about all things COVID, but I can tell you that I understand what happened in the financial system during COVID, and that's just a continuation of everything that laid out from 2009 onward. In fact, in 2019, we spent another $22 trillion that nobody knows about to backstop a run in derivatives trades. Once again, which was the same thing that took out everything in 2008. But in this case, it got buried quickly because COVID came on, and then all of a sudden we were dealing with a mass pandemic. And yeah, there's a lot of strange things about that. But the New York Times did get some interesting front page news this weekend that I was very enthralled with. The Texas state legislature, the Republicans themselves, have implemented an impeachment proceeding for the Attorney General of Texas, a guy by the name of Ken Paxton. And God, do you know how badly corrupt you'd have to be for the Texas Republicans to turn against you? So I thought that was interesting. But considering all of the corruption that's going on, I found myself going back to an interview that I listened to earlier in the week from Russell Brand interviewing Democratic primary presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And it was a fantastic dialogue. And I think Mr. Kennedy Jr., is that what we call him? I guess we should just call him Bobby. That's what I was actually told to call him. And the bottom line is that he really, really has an incredible grasp and thoughtfulness of just incredibly complex issues. And a lot of the times I find him on the corruption side incredibly skilled and incredibly informed. And hopefully he'll become even more informed as his campaign begins to progress. And I really was very intrigued with Russell Brand's interaction with him. But of course, one of the things that has been kind of a headline issue, and I think getting a lot of, shall we say, attention online over the course of the last month, was kind of this shot over the bow when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Announced his candidacy, that one of the first things he began dealing with is the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and saying that, yes, indeed, he was pretty convinced, given the incredible amount of information out there, that he was assassinated by the CIA, which is incredible, right? But at the same time, for any of you who have been following Oliver Stone really since, the early 90s, Oliver Stone has presented a lot of this stuff, but particularly as it related to a documentary that he released last year, initially for Showtime, and then later I think he did a self-distribution of a longer 4-part series that I watched that was just magnificent. And the amount of evidence that he sets forth that's available, that anybody who wants to go and really do the research and understand all of the elements that have been brought to the public's attention over the course of decades, and still so much more is hidden. But it was remarkable how clear it is that at the very least we should have investigated the CIA up and down and found out what the hell happened, because the entirety of everything that happened immediately after the Kennedy assassination, just in terms of the autopsy and just in terms of who did what, when, and how, and all of the other things, were completely ludicrous. And we've had this information for a long time. And so anybody who has ever paid attention to this information, just based on the facts alone, would not be shocked when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just announces that, yeah, the CIA murdered my uncle. Okay, well, let's just say that if the nation finally comes to grips with the JFK assassination, then what else do we have to come to grips with? The last 50 years. Because who did it? Why? And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a lot of questions, a lot of incredibly important questions that reveal what we are all basically fighting about right now, which is it's who's in control and why. And I think there's a direct corollary that I'll address, hopefully, if I can remember it when I conclude this. But at the same time, very legitimate questions and very important to understand. But if you actually get to that point, then you have to ask yourself, why would the American people be so flaccid when we find out that and that unelected intelligence um, funded by the government apparatus could assassinate our own president. I mean, it's ridiculous to even be addressing this in 2023, but the level of secrecy and obfuscation and conspiracy, as well as complicity by the media, are all part and parcel to this ginormous question. And that might be where everything begins, let alone ends, quite frankly. As I mentioned in one of my previous truth bombs, I had a really profound moment when I was putting in a cab one of the greatest writers of finance that exists. And this guy does due diligence and research like nobody I've ever come across. And he said to me as I was putting him in the cab, the day it all started was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And I was like, holy shit, right? So, anyway, just thoughts on that, but it does dovetail into what it is that I'm trying to reveal to you and why. And so, as I was, kind of thinking about all things, Robert F. Kennedy presidential campaign in context to what I just said, it led me to reveal or review, quite frankly, another interview that I saw like a year ago, but it was really cool in this context to watch again with regarding Matt Taibbi on Useful Idiots, and that show's no longer, but this was like a year ago with Katie Helper, and they interviewed Oliver Stone. And again, Oliver Stone just went down the list, the check boxes of this happened, that happened, everything happened. And Matt Taibbi did a great summation because we're both, part of the same, we're the same age, we're peers, right, in terms of our age. And a lot of the stuff that Taibbi addressed was on the money, but it's just so fascinating because as Taibbi has such an understanding of all of that era's questions, he also has so much understanding of everything that created the great financial crisis, maybe more so than most, if not all, except for yours truly. But beyond that, it's really fascinating that he's willing to talk about certain things and not willing to talk about others, and how he's positioning certain things, which I find incredibly troublesome and frustrating. So I enjoy most of what Taibbi does, always have. But I've had a big question mark regarding, what appears to me placating MAGA. I happened to see an article or a Twitter yesterday that Matt Taibbi has never accepted or worked for a billionaire except for a short time at The Intercept, where he was working for Pierre Omidyar, who was a billionaire, tech billionaire, and he didn't last there too long. And his point is, look, I don't need to depend on billionaires to fund what I do. What, in my estimation, he's depending on is clickbait for MAGA. Because 2 weeks ago, was the big consternation and, from their side, the big drama around this John Durham revelation that, Russiagate was bullshit. And again, I'll admit all day, every day that, yeah, there's all sorts of whacked out stuff involved with the Clinton Foundation and their involvement with the Steele dossier and everything that the Clintons may have done, or at least the mechanics and the machinery and people loyal to Clinton during the 2016 election with Donald Trump. But to me, just the fact that it's focused specifically on that aspect of it, as opposed to understanding, Vladimir Putin, Deutsche Bank, and Trump. Enough said. That's the collusion. And the fact that that's not part of the mainstream makes me go, well, what the fuck? kind of similar to mainstream not understanding what the fuck happened at 9/11, let alone what we don't know this many years later about the Kennedy assassination. They have for decades tried to, basically quash any notion of conspiracy theory. Like people get in the weeds and it gets crazy. No, people do uh, conspiratorial activity all the time. And it's not theory, it's just you've got to be able to prove it, which requires work. And if you try to discount it and, poke holes in it, there might be a reason that you did that. So in the case of the Kennedy assassination, I think it's pretty safe to say that there should have been a lot more investigation into everything that covered it up, particularly when you know that it was the Dulles brothers that were in charge. And who were the Dulles brothers? They were in charge of the CIA, which incidentally, they came out of Sullivan and Cromwell, the mega law firm that seems to have a whole lot more power than anybody in this country has any understanding of, which dovetails directly into what it is that I'm telling you. And I'll get to that as I try to conclude. So, as conspiracy theory moves forward, we see all over Twitter that Epstein hashtag has gotten a lot of attention for a long time. And that thing goes a lot of different directions. And if you pay attention to what MAGA says, it's really all about the Clintons and, the sort of blood libel and Pizzagate and trafficking, vulnerable children and that sort of thing. And this horrific, response to that, as in look at how horrible these Democrats are, and really labeling them with the blood libel, which has actually been a thing, against Jews for over a millennium. But in this particular case, the real questions are incredibly fascinating. So there's this journalist by the name of Whitney Webb, who I've seen all over the place, and beginning with Jimmy Dore, quite frankly, where she reveals all of these incredibly important and contextualized revelations as it relates to Chase and Jamie Dimon, Ehud Barak and Mossad potentially, even though that's a little bit murky, but some Israelis, and definitely Bill Gates, as well as now Elon Musk, right? And then the further you go into the Epstein scenario, you look into, oh my God, the guy's all over MIT. He's involved with some of the greatest minds in the United States and through tech, and of course Bill Gates and Microsoft, and and then everything that has come out recently in terms of leveraging Bill Gates because of some other quandary with one of the women that were part of his stable that he got some money for, and it gets weirder and weirder the deeper and deeper that you get. And then of course Epstein died in prison during Donald Trump's presidency, which again, going back to this sort of theme, it's like, are you kidding me? And it wasn't until I think this last week that I've seen some mainstream coverage, both from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, both kind of covering safe places with the Epstein scenario, but not going anywhere near where Whitney Webb is going, and some of the really decades-long problematic scenarios that reveal, again, the power structure of this country, which is financial more than anything. Finance, tech, geopolitical, military, industrial, and of course fossil fuel wrapped into one, which then extends, if you understand anything about the CIA, with the CIA's involvement on behalf of all of those industries going back to just immediately after World War II. But in this particular case, it's like, okay, so the mainstream is going to dip its toe in the water because they kind of have to, because a lot of people online are talking about it, but at the same time, not giving us an expose, not doing a deep dive, not really revealing what Whitney Webb has gone, chapter and verse way beyond what mainstream media has done, not to mention connecting, intelligence to mob-like scenarios. But anybody who understands history understands there has been a thing about sexual, what's the word I'm looking for? When you set people up, you set powerful people up, you have information on them. So once you have information on them, you can leverage them. That's the thing that's probably gone back hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, probably thousands of years. But definitely in our financial system, going back to the S&L crisis and everything that's come since, this is just what they do. Now, Epstein's definitely a very interesting component of that. I've got gazillions of questions, but Whitney Webb's work led me to understand a correlation of things that I knew about going back to the savings and loan crisis in the 80s and the 90s, which basically intersect between savings and loans and junk bonds and gun running and drug smuggling and the airlines that enabled that to happen, which were CIA airlines like they had during Vietnam, which was Air America. And of course, when you go that direction, you have to understand that yeah, there were opium wars and heroin traffic for centuries that propped up a lot of Western imperialist governments, and it's part of the same story. And it's just fascinating that, again, the corollary between these three scenarios that I've mentioned so far in this truth bomb all have the same sort of pattern, formula, thumbprints, etc. But again, none of them come close to the information that I've continued to provide to you, which ultimately is the core of everything. And I'll push that just a little bit further because I want to get some of these other concepts out before I summarize. So, the deep state and shadow government and paranoia and conspiracy theory can become a manipulative tool by those that are in intelligence that control this stuff. And there's so much psychological, gymnastics and control and wrestling matches and all of those types of things, that are all wound up in this. And a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, spits out into anti Semitism. Now, interestingly enough, I just read on Saturday that the Biden administration is going to have a actual, effort, I think led by our vice president's husband, who is Jewish, and it's a campaign to discuss and deal with anti-Semitism, and I applaud it. I think it's fantastic. But there's one caveat that I'll say to that, and what I've said all along, that corruption births fascism, and that there are a lot of Jews in finance and in media that are in on many of these huge problems that I continue to reveal to you, but they didn't do it because they're Jewish. Nowhere in the Jewish religion does it say this is what you're going to do. No, they did it because they made individual choices, and thank God there was a lot more people in on it, including former President Barack Obama and the Clintons and everybody else. It's just the power structure. Are there Jews involved with this? Yeah, there's black people involved. There's white people. There's women. There's probably gay people. Who knows? One of my biggest criticisms of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders is that they talk about corruption all the time, but they do so in platitudes and they play by the corrupt's rules. Again, which is what I am revealing to you. And ultimately, through this insane psychological warfare that can prey on people's natural tendencies, because I think we as people know that, yeah, you can be up to no good and you can do some things that you're ashamed of, maybe things that were illegal, maybe things that are horrific. It runs the gamut, right? People can tell secrets, people can lie, people can steal and cheat and do, things that are the dark side. Surprise, that's the whole thing about good and evil. I mean, are you in control and so forth? And it's weird. I tend to, and just a quick commentary on this, I tend to think that those that are projecting about, all of the sexual slavery and all of those things that take place, I believe we're victims of this stuff. It's just really weird. I see these right-wing people that are like, oh my God, can you believe this? I mean, it was going all gangbusters on Twitter, like a month ago, or actually I'm losing track of time. Probably when Elon Musk took over Twitter, there was about a 2-week time period where the thing that was trending was all about sexual trafficking. Am I saying sexual trafficking doesn't exist? Of course not. Sexual trafficking, again, like everything else, has been around probably for centuries. Maybe, what am I talking about? As long as mankind's been around. I mean, slaves. What? This is part and parcel to human history. So yes, is it real? Is it a specific group behind the scenes that's doing it all? Yeah, most of the time, drug dealers, mob guys, people that have gone there whose business model is to fucking destroy people, get them hooked up on, every which way to, addiction and all of those things that go with it, gambling, alcohol, drugs, so on and so forth, and then sex smuggling, prostitution, you name it, whatever. Again, this is nothing new. The only thing that's probably new about it is how coordinated it can get. And I guarantee you there's going to be a story coming down the pike here soon that's going to reveal a lot of the power players that are involved with this at a level that's never happened before, because I know the people that are doing the story. But at the same time, as it relates to Epstein, it tends to show this incredible. It's like a pretzel. All of this stuff is a pretzel, where it's like the more you have people in the shadows doing things with powerful people, of course you're going to ask questions, which then leads to conspiracy. But of course, if the mainstream's hiding it, then why are they hiding it? There's reasons governments like the CIA leverage these types of situations because they get information, because it gives them more power in a geopolitical scenario or in warlike scenarios, and that's just the way it goes. And maybe with the advent of technology and everything that's been happening over the course of the last, I don't know, maybe 2 decades because of technology, a lot of this stuff has become even more capable of manipulation, right? And so again, the the line between reality and fiction is who's giving you the information. And unfortunately, when everybody's reacting really quick to things that they know aren't giving us the story. So, for example, Russell Brand, Joe Rogan, anybody else second tier from there, um, are justifiably responding to the mainstream's lack of investigative journalism. And if the mainstream has betrayed that trust, which they have, for access journalism and power, and basically working for the power, then again, it's just another reflection that you no longer live in the United States. That's why I frame this thing all the time, that we are a corrupt fascist state that's undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to fuel the mafiocracy and then, of course, fascism. Now, that's the last piece of the puzzle that's the most important. Because, look, I guess I should set it up this way, right? So, what's the biggest beef typically about Jews? They control the world, right? Like there's been this thing for a certain group of people, particularly those on the far right, that are easily manipulated, and they've been around for centuries and a millennium, right? Blame the Jews. Now, are Jews wildly successful? A lot of them? Yes, they are. Typically because they're incredibly intelligent, that come through the system to rise to great heights, to make incredible fortunes based on the nature of the way the game is played. But a lot of these guys earned every cent of it, and then maybe the system itself did certain things that we could take issue with. But the bottom line is, if you're in tech, if you're in medicine, if you're in the law, if you're in any of these scenarios that require incredibly capable and industrious intellectual capacity, then yeah, Jewish people have percentage excelled in incredible ways, because typically Jewish people are very committed to academia. The entire Jewish religion is based on reading Talmud and understanding and interpreting and debating and understanding, God's will in the context of what society does. And so that's a great foundation for the principles of intelligence. And so, sure, it's incredible when you look at the scenario of, I think the population of Jews in the United States is 2%. If there wasn't a Holocaust, I think I've seen numbers up there about 36 million Jews would be in existence today. 36, 40 million, somewhere in there, if it wasn't for the Holocaust. There's 13 million Jews, I think, globally. And of that, 2% in the United States of the population. And if you look at the Forbes top, was it 400? There's a good, healthy dose of Jewish people, percentage-wise, that are in the billionaire class. And I haven't seen any actual statistics on this, but I guarantee you that if you go into the top 1%, which I think the threshold for entry is about 5 million, a lot of doctors and accountants and, entrepreneurs and people that do all sorts of things, are part of the 1% that happen to be Jewish. And I say this all the time. You can't hate the 1%, even though the disparity of wealth is a significant problem. The problem is you can't, it's ridiculous to focus on enterprising people that are incredibly gifted, that get to a place of success, and you're going to blame them because they're Jews. I mean, to me, that's incredible, especially because of my background. So my background is I come from a mixed family, but I am Jewish. And my dad came from a family that were Catholic. And my grandmother went between Christian Science and some other things, and then came back to Catholicism. But they definitely weren't Jewish. And the other half of my dad's family were Lutheran. They were German farmers from Germany that settled in Texas, and that was what they were. And my mom's side of the family is Jewish, from Ukraine of all things. And my grandfather was the most important, inspiring person to me in my life, and he was a guy that was incredibly invigorating and enterprising, and a smart guy, and a great entertainer at that. And I mean, it was my North Star. And so I detest anti-Semitism. But I do acknowledge that there are Jews in the system that have been part of the system that I have revealed to you that are very, very. It's almost it's really hard for me to believe that people would be involved with such a grand, deceptive con that understand history. But it's, I guess, so alluring for power, money, and control that some people get wrapped up in it. And in this particular case, some Jews have. That doesn't mean they were responsible for the whole thing by any means. Like I said, it was a consortium of many people. And I go back to the metaphor, not metaphor, but the example. Like at Weinstein's production company, it was female HR people that would set up women to be raped because they got ahead for doing it. I mean, people do really fucked up things when they're trying to get ahead, when they're trying to find power, when they're willing to be complicitous or duplicitous in a crime. And you know what? That's the criminal mindset. And if you don't hold it accountable, you have absolute chaos that leads to these sorts of tinderboxes that can become extremely dangerous, which is, of course, what happened in World War II. And I know Hitler like the back of my hand. I know pretty much every aspect of Hitler's, history, and everything that happened during the Third Reich. And trust me, I'm of the mindset never again. But what I'm trying to tell you in the context to conspiracy theory versus racketeering, which is a conspiracy, journalistic integrity versus the capacity for access and pulling punches to keep certain people in power to play that political game. When you destroy the integrity of systems, you're going to get chaos, and you're going to ultimately wind up with tragedy. That's just how it works. It has always worked that way. It will always be that way. If you look back to the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Roman Empire was based on corruption. If you want to look at all of the schisms throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, based on the separation of the Catholic Church and all of the different Christianity that came up at that time period, it was corruption that led that. The Kennedy assassination, if the CIA is involved and the media hit it, that's corruption. And then what about 9/11? What about 2008? I can give you every piece of the puzzle that is lock, stock, and barrel that has been covered up by the government by way of the media because nobody else is told the whole story. What they did was they literally had all of these different investigations, the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, the settlements with all of the banks, and then the national mortgage settlement that tell you all the different pieces of what it is that I'm telling you. But nobody's actually laid it all out, which is what I've done. And what does it lead to? Well, it leads to the revelation of the $29 trillion backdoor of the Federal Reserve to a corrupt financial system that got that way through racketeering. And nowhere does it say in the statutes that the full faith and credit of the United States is there to backstop criminal activity. That would be ridiculous. But that's what we did. And so here I am, a Jewish guy from a mixed family and whatever else. And I'm not that religious, but at the same time, yeah, I believe in a higher power. But all of the, I'm mystified by the universe. Let's put it that way. But I understand systems and I understand how things are supposed to work. And I know when they don't work. And I went on this monumental 13-year odyssey that basically took everything away from me that mattered. And I've been carrying this thing on my back like a fucking cross. I mean, it's the burden I have. And I'm all in. And it's like, to what extent, right? And so ultimately, I'm like the king without a crown. Not to compare myself to Jesus, who was actually fighting a very similar battle based on corruption, if you really understand the historical prerogatives from what I understand. And things just get so demented with people and, who's controlling what, when, and how. And this is usually the sort of underpinnings of what creates war, and it's the human experience. It's been that way forever. What I'm trying to get to you is that, look, if this goes away, It would be the equivalent of literally understanding what took place during the JFK assassination, 9/11, and whether or not aliens have visited the Earth and the government covered it up. I know those sound like they've been made to sound crazy. They're not, but at the same time, what I'm telling you is so lock, stock, and barrel based on what we give to you in the con. And I've got 300 hours sitting on the shelf, and I'm trying to create a tidal wave crusade to purge corruption because I have the answers that the entire system of power has kept from us, which creates this splintered, out of control scenario where the power is in complete control. They've raped and pillaged and looted the United States. And now we're basically a third world country with nukes. I'm ashamed of our country. That's not who we are. We have such capable, incredibly intelligent, incredibly powerful, whether it's in the scientific community, whether it's in any aspect of American existence, we have geniuses in every direction. But we also have a lot of, unfortunately, very naive people that are easily grifted. And that's part and parcel to this long history of like snake oil salesmen. And you've got to be able to pick and choose. And that's why I know that there's over 50 million victims of the 2008 financial crisis in the United States alone, and that's just from the housing collapse. That does not include the pensioners, that does not include the stuff that's happening globally. And I have to be able to create a grassroots, rising tide raises all ships push to be able to get this truth above the madness of deception and the diabolical manipulation of this system that I've just spent however long I've spent to unpack. And it's ultimately, what I'm asking. The ask is that there's three things that I'm trying to get done at the same time. One is we've got a petition campaign that we're hoping to get as many signatures on as we possibly can to be able to send that out of the blue to my former partner, who I hope will see that there's a lot of people out there who don't want the truth erased from history. From what I understand, he's just making a business decision. If nobody's going to be, renting or looking at the con, even though there's 100 million plus people that should be, but we can't penetrate this noise. We haven't been able to. But if we can somehow get him to keep it up, maybe we can eventually. But it's going to go away June 30th, and that has all of the information that I've just revealed to you. Now, in addition to that, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a podcast where I can welcome on a lot of the people that are in the con, as well as tell stories about not tell stories, reveal the reality of all of these things that are taking place in the courts that are destroying people right now with the legal documentation fraud by the system that's stealing money that the Federal Reserve made available to the too big to fail banks that are basically using the courts to lie to destroy people and steal their house. By the way, this is nothing new too if you really understand the composite of history. It's just a massive smash and grab. That's what imperialist powers have done forever. And there's a whole way and methodology they do it. What they did in 2008 that leads to now is this continuation of this story. And we've been living on it nonstop for the last 13 years. So, for example, if you look around right now, there's so much overbuilding in the United States, that makes it look like we've got this like really incredibly dynamic and pounding economy and everything else. And we all know that it's not. Most of it's based on living week to week, month to month. But those of you who have fallen by the wayside, and then the only percentage of the people that the system has worked for in the last 13 years are those that are the top 10%. Those that have skin in the game, that have good jobs, that are probably professionals, that pay their bills on time, that never got behind the eight ball, that were able to utilize low interest rates and credit and to increase their wealth. In fact, most people that become rich know that the time you become rich is when the economy fails and you take advantage of opportunities. And that's what's happened. And a lot of those people are looking around going, look, what's the problem? I didn't make mistakes. I didn't get into a house that I couldn't afford. So why should I give a shit about you? Well, most of the time, most people don't care about anything until something really bad happens to them. And we might be on the verge of something really, really bad happening. I've been waiting for like the last 18 months for the economy to collapse, but it hasn't. And I might be wrong. Maybe the Federal Reserve figured this whole thing out. I mean, once we started seeing the bank runs like, a month ago, that I thought, okay, there's one of two things going to happen. And I guessed at the time, we're going to bail them out. And we did. And there's more, carnage on the way. But it just means more consolidation through the too big to fail banks, of which one of them, as we can see in this Epstein scenario, is Chase. And Chase and Jamie Dimon have been involved with all sorts of strange international craziness, including what appears to be laundering and all sorts of racketeering. In fact, there's five convictions of Chase over the course of the last 5 years alone, or 7 years, that including a RICO conviction. They're a crime shop. But yet, if you read the New York Times, there's no mention of that. Just that Jamie Dimon saved the economy once again. No, he didn't. The government didn't. He was the face on it, and he's connected all the stuff, including Epstein. Look, I mean, guys, it's complicated. It's incredibly thick and voluminous. But I have the answers. I have the access to the people that can take this down. And so the final consideration is I'm trying to get millions of you to invest $13 in our effort to elevate all of this stuff. And it's going to be a podcast initially. If we get to $20,000, we're going to create, which is $19,900. We're going to create a podcast that basically allows us to get our 501c3 or C4, the proper mechanics of what this is going to be to build this podcast, to move all of this information forward. And then we're going to continue fundraising. And if we're organized and we can make this happen, it's basically a presidential campaign. But it's a presidential campaign to purge corruption. And that's my final line. If you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity, sustainability, integrity, and decency and dignity, I think I said that off the top, then if we merge in unity, we'll defeat the misery of tyranny. And that's our destiny. We got to create a clean new deal. We got to recreate separation of powers. We got to root out the corruption from the Supreme Court through Congress, through the judiciary. We got to expose it all. And the only way we're going to do it above the madness of this noise is if we do it with this information. Because one of three things are probably going to happen, right? We're going to end up with, let's say Biden wins, and then there's going to be the illusion that, okay, the ship is uprighted itself, it can function, everything's fine. Okay. Meanwhile, the power is the power, and that's probably what they want. If the MAGAs come in, it goes from right wing to right wing squared, and there's a lot of fucking downstream, real bad stuff that could happen from that. And it really, given the AR-15s and all of the other stuff with abortions and everything else, why would you want to sit on the sidelines and allow them to get away with that because of this binary, scenario with the duopoly that are both absolutely corrupt? And then the third way, of course, which I don't see actually happening, is some far left communist manifesto that somehow replaces what fascism could be and leads us to like an American Stalin. I don't really see that happening, but there'll be pockets of it. That's for sure. Or of course, maybe somebody like Robert F. Kennedy gets into a position like Bernie Sanders did and maybe pushes the needle on everything. But unless there's millions of people equipped with the truth, there's no chance to overcome the rot and the core of this tumor of corruption that has complete control. And unfortunately, media has completely lied to us. That's why I'm a muckraker. I'm bringing you these truths, and I can stand alone, and I'm standing naked in front of everybody. This is the emperor's new clothes and some dimension of, Humpty Dumpty. I hate to use a children's parable to paint the picture, but it's that simple. And again, nothing has ever changed. This is what happens throughout history. It's just amazing that this is what's happened to the United States, and it's happened for one reason and one reason only. We don't have character. We don't have the fortitude to uphold integrity and the standards. And we found it easier to go along, the professional class, to go along with the corruption. So not the most pleasant speech, truth bomb on, Memorial Day weekend, but I don't know what else to say. It's the convergence of everything, and I've got the answers, and I hope you'll support me and join me. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt, onwards and upwards.